But teaching your children values is, in effect, sacrificing to the world in a way that they wouldn't if you weren't teaching them the values, but it's also what allows them to live a fulfilling life. In doing that, in pre-committing your child to values, this is one of the major problems that I have with the way that the left has rewritten parenting. This idea of parenting is that you're just supposed to let your kid rush out into the world without any preparation at all, without any pre-committed set of values, and discover the world on their own without anything. Now, it's one thing to say you should encounter danger. It's another thing to make everything inherently more dangerous by not preparing your child for the possibility of a world that requires values and meaning.
Well, by the way, we saw this at hand in Sweden, where we weren't sure why there was so much support for everything that you're doing in Sweden. And when we do this Q&A after, where people are submitting questions, you know, online, and then I look through them as Jordan's doing his talk, and then we answer questions. And 90% of the questions had to do with gender issues, and a ton of them were about genderless kindergartens and the emasculation of the father and all of this stuff. And it's like, that's exactly what you're saying. You've given these kids
it's also extremely
it's
also extremely interesting, following up on your line of reasoning, that, well, let's say you do decide, well, I'm going to launch my children out into the world to let them discover everything by themselves. Well, so what happens is, well, the world becomes so terrifying that you have to protect them from everything, because they don't have any autonomy, they don't have any, exactly, they don't have any discipline, they don't have any inbuilt values, all of that. And so the counter consequence of that maximal freedom, and I've seen this with people, they have 2-year-old kids, and they put no restraints on them whatsoever. They haven't taught the kid what no means. Like, and you can teach a kid what no means very rapidly. So if you have a child that's learning to crawl, for example, and, you know, maybe they're going to go pull something heavy off a shelf, all you have to do is grab them by the leg and hold them and say no over and over until they stop doing what they're doing, and they'll usually cry. And so, you know, that's cruel. Okay, so you stop them. And then if you do that for a week, then all you have to do is say no, and they'll cry and stop. And then 2 weeks later, they won't cry, they'll just stop. Now, no is a big deal, right? Because no is the imposition of the patriarchy against that instinctive exploratory
the noble
force.
Savage,
Yeah, that's right, against the noble savage, right? So it's a big deal, no. So, but then, okay, now, once your child has got that, you can leave them be. Because they can explore like mad.
Yeah,
first of all, you can stop them by saying no, and so that's really helpful, because if they're going to do something dangerous, a word will do it. But second, kids are really smart, and what I learned with my kids was, once you taught them that there were 5 things in the house they couldn't do, then they generalized from that, and they figured out the pattern of the things they couldn't do, and then they wouldn't do them. And then you could leave them alone. They could be autonomous. And then parents would come over who didn't teach their kids no. And they would follow their 2-year-old around like totalitarians 100% of the time, because they couldn't trust them to have any autonomy at all. So the consequence of that absolute lack of discipline is the necessity for constant supervision.
And this is, it's also one of the reasons why I have so much trouble with the way, you speak of the genderless parenting aspect. It's one of the reasons I have so much trouble with all of this. This idea that that everything is biologically pre-written and biologically determined, and that how you raise your children has no impact on how their future life goes, is such asinine bullshit. I mean, sorry to put it that way, but it just is. I have 2 kids under 5. It is absolute nonsense. So I told a story the other day on the radio, or on my show, on the podcast, about my son. So my son is 2.5 years old, and he is just a delightful human being, which means that if he were an adult, he'd be the worst person ever, right? Because 2-year-olds are savages. This is what they are. Anybody who tells you that children are naturally good is totally full of it. Children are naturally innocent. Children are naturally not good. Children are naturally selfish and mean and brutal to each other. And then they're joyous, and then they're full of joy, right? This is what they are. And so my son, he has an older sister, and his older sister loves sparkly things. It's just her thing. She's a girl. Right? And she's very girly. And so she has all of these sparkly shoes lying around. And so my son decided that he wanted to go and put on his sister's sparkly shoes. And I went to him and I said, no, those are girl shoes. I said, no, those are girl shoes. We don't wear those. And he said, and he started to fuss. He said, no, he said, I won't say her name. I want her shoes. I want her shoes. And I said, those are girl things. And then I took him to the Western Outfitters over here in Van Nuys. And I got him a pair of cowboy boots. And he will not take off his cowboy boots. Now, the way the left would see that is me cruelly crushing his spirit. Perhaps he just wants to be a girl. Perhaps he wants to be raised in an effeminate manner. Yeah, except that by me giving him the choice, by going and getting him cowboy boots and then saying, here's some cowboy boots, and that's more gender appropriate, it turns out that that's what he likes. And you know what? Even if he didn't like that, he's 2.5 years old. I get to decide for him.
The amount of hate that I'm going to get just for sitting here listening to you tell that story of how you parent. And I didn't push back on Shapiro, who didn't want his son to wear sparkly shoes, Rubin.
He's not an adult. When he's 17, if he makes an affirmative case why he should wear sparkly shoes, go for it.
Yeah.
When he's 2.5, I'm the guy who gets to instill the system that I think will lead to his greatest happiness. I am the totalitarian in my own house. I am the king of my own house. And I get to determine whether I think my child will live a happier life struggling with the desire to wear sparkly shoes at age 25, or whether it might be better for him to be brought up in a situation where it's easier to choose in line with gender stereotyping. That, by the way, is reflected over every human culture. The idea that gender stereotyping is unique to the West is absolute nonsense. There are differentiations between how we treat men and how we treat women in every culture in the history of humanity.
Yeah, well, that again is why the Sweden thing was so interesting to me, because we found out basically, as you laid out, and feel free to clean this up, was that they've done egalitarianism right. Men and women have been equal for quite some time, and yet still what has happened there is that more men are engineers and more women are nurses.
Yeah, and the men and women are more different.
They're still different.
Right.
Yeah, more different.
Exactly, that's right.
And yet the social justice warriors, or whatever this thing is, they won't let them have the win. So they ran the experiment.
Well, the other issue here, too, is, well, imagine that, just hypothetically, imagine that you were going to try to raise your children gender neutral. Okay, so there was actually studies done on this back 30 years ago, where they looked at self-professed feminist parents and self-professed non-feminist parents, and then coded their interactions blindly for gender stereotypical behavior, and found no difference between the two groups. Well, and the reason for that is, you know, you think that you socialize your children entirely if you're a social constructionist. It's all top down, right? Because your child's a blank slate. But your child isn't. Your child is manifesting to a greater or lesser degree all sorts of gendered behaviors, and powerfully. And a lot of what you're doing, especially if you're a good parent, is you're reacting to what your child is manifesting as an individual. And so a lot of the socialization, that so-called the socialization, which sounds like top-down, is actually the establishment of a singular relationship between you as the parent and that individual child with their nature. And this is also reflected in the behavioral genetics literature, because what you see is that, imagine there's 3 sources of variation in children's behavior. There's biological, there's shared environment, so this would be the siblings. So this would be what was the same in the family for the siblings, and then what was different. And then you look at the behavioral outcome and you calculate how much was biological, how much was shared environment, and how much was non-shared environment. What you find is it's almost all biology and non-shared environment. And so people have read that to say, well, parents don't matter because there's no shared environment. But it's not the case, because what happens is, if you're a good parent, is the relationship you have with child 1 is significantly different than the relationship that you have with child 2. Even though there may be moral presumptions that are organizing your family that are in common. The times when you're treating your
children identically are almost never.
Right.
Almost never.
That's right. Well, why
back
would you...
to Cain and Abel, right? I mean, but this is right. I mean, like, if God is the parent figure in that story, treating your children differentially is a way of being a good parent.
That's
if you
right.
treat your kids exactly the same, you're not being responsive to your kids, and you are teaching them that essentially there are no consequences to actions, because your kids take different actions, right? No matter what, it's the same outcome. Well, that's not good parenting.
Right. That's almost the definition of totalitarian parenting, and it is exactly the kind of relationship that you don't want to have with anyone. Right? You want all of your relationships to be individualized and particularized, and so we radically underestimate the degree to which the gendered interactions between children and parents are driven by the children. So here's a funny experiment. There's some evidence that parents who drink more are more likely to have children with ADHD. Now, I'm not a big fan of ADHD diagnosis, but we'll leave that aside. Okay, so then there was some suggestion that maybe, well, ADHD is part of a genetic complex that involves alcoholism and antisocial personality, because those things also clump together. And so there's various experiments done to see if that is the case. And there's a fair bit of diagnostic overlap between childhood conduct disorder and ADHD, so it's kind of messy. Irrelevant. Here's the experiment. You bring parents in to interact with children who aren't their own, and you have them do an alcohol taste test. And so the taste test is, well, here's rum and Coke, and here's vodka and orange juice, and here's orange juice, and here's water. And what we want you to do is to just rate the taste of each of these beverages, okay? And so then we expose you to some children. And one of the children is a child with a diagnosis of ADHD, and one of the children is one that doesn't. And then, so you do that with a bunch of parents, and then you have them do the taste test. Okay, well, you don't care what they rate the damn drinks, you just care how much they drink. And it turns out that the parents that were exposed to the kids that have attention deficit disorder drink far more. Yeah, so, but it's a good example of the idea of bidirectionality and socialization. It's like, you have a relationship with your child. Now, you obviously enforce a certain degree of social norm if you're sensible, because you want your child to be socialized and desirable to other people. You want them to be able to play reciprocally, and you want them to be attentive enough to adults so that adults treat them well, so the world opens up to them, right? So that's what you're doing. But other than that, you're particularizing like mad, because even to get that child to that end state requires a particularized path. You know, my daughter was intrinsically very cooperative, and my son was intrinsically very competitive. And so the pathway to getting them both to be reciprocal players was substantially different, even though the desired outcome, and they became reciprocal players. Like they were popular kids who were in constant demand as playmates, which I think is the hallmark of successful parenting, by the way. By the time, if your kids are 4 and other kids really want to play with them, it's like, you did it, you got it right. And if they're not, then something's gone seriously wrong.